Okay, thank you. So I'll be talking about some ideas for a new prover system that we're trying to make as fast as possible. And this may eventually become a rewrite of Plonky2 that maybe we'll call it Plonky3, or maybe we'll come up with some better name. So just a recap of Plonky2. Plonky2 is a Plonk-Fry library that's kind of focused on performance. I think there are a lot of things some things we got right to make it pretty fast. We use a small field that we call the Goldilocks field. So it's a 64-bit field that works pretty well on CPUs. Besides that, we've optimized several parts of the main prover bottlenecks pretty well. So for example, FFTs and hashing is all vectorized. And we have a very, very optimized recursion circuit. So recursion is very fast. But there's still room for improvement. One thing is that I'm going to argue the field is still too large. I think 64 bits is still larger than we want for a field. Also, we're always dealing with power of 2 subgroups in Plonky2. So sometimes we can have a circuit where we just go over a power of 2, and then half of the witness ends up just being padding to get to the next power of 2. Also, there's a lot, as Wei touched on, there's a lot of overhead with witness generation because Plonky2 stores this explicit dependency graph in memory, and there's a lot of overhead there. And finally, Plonky2, things like the FFT code in Plonky2 aren't written with very good locality. So it's fine if you have a small circuit and then everything is basically in cache anyway. But if you have a larger circuit, then we're loading small pieces of data from random bits of main memory, and it doesn't work very well. So what's the optimal size for a field to use? The reason we originally picked a 64-bit field for Plonky2 is that that's the largest field that most CPUs have some kind of native support for. So on x86, for example, x86 64, there's a mul instruction which takes 64-bit inputs and gives a 128-bit output. So that works pretty well, and modern CPUs can do, I think, 1 per cycle of throughput. But keeping in mind, though, this is only for scalar instructions like mul. And when we want to build a really high-performance prover, usually we want to vectorize all of the bottlenecks. So we want to use things like AVX2 instead of just simple mul scalar code. And if we look at vector instruction sets like AVX2, they only support 32-bit multiplication. So like in Plonky2, we do use AVX2, but we don't get that much benefit from it because we have to take these 64-bit elements and break them up, and it becomes 4 32-bit multiplications. So with the 32-bit field, it's much more direct. We can directly vectorize it in a way that fits the hardware better. Also, if we do use GPUs, then as far as I know, it's all 32-bit ALUs there. So 32 bits just seems like the best fit for current hardware. And there's another angle to this also, which is what's the effect on the circuit size? Like if we go to a 32-bit field, does that mean that now we need twice as many elements for the same circuit or the same witness? And for some circuits, the answer is yes. If we're doing something like big num arithmetic, where we really benefit from having a larger limb size, the larger our field is, the larger limbs we can use. But a lot of other circuits are just doing things like maybe 16-bit lookups. And for 16-bit lookups, we're not using those extra bits, right? Maybe even 32 bits is too large because even then we're wasting half the bits in our field. So we looked at a few 32-bit fields, and we started by looking at just the handful that have good two-adicity, since that's what we usually expect in a proof system. And I wrote a couple here, but we couldn't find any that we really liked. I'm not aware of any really nice reduction algorithms for these fields that have good two-adicity. Nothing beautiful like the Goldilocks field where we can quickly take 2 to the 64 and it just immediately shrinks to 2 to the 32. So coincidentally, there happens to be a 31-bit Mersenne field, this prime number here, 2 to the 31 minus 1. So that's what we really want to use because that has the really beautiful reduction that's very fast and very simple. But this field does not have the two-adicity that systems like Stark's usually expect. So how can we actually use that field? So one thing we can do is instead of using, say, a Frye-based polynomial commitment scheme, we can use something like Breakdown or Orion, which really work with arbitrary fields. There's some effect, but for the most part, they don't require things like two-adicity. They just require a field of a reasonable size, I think, for Breakdown. And so these are both based, there's kind of two components here. There's this core PCS from the BCG 20 paper, which is based on tensor codes, and it can really work with any linear code. So then Breakdown and Orion, they proposed particular linear codes that we can use, which have very fast encoders in order to make this fast and practical. So here's basically the definition of the Spielman code that Breakdown and Orion follow with some variations. It's very simple. It's basically just doing some matrix multiplication where these matrices are sparse expander matrices. And then there's a recursive call to some inner code. And we tried prototyping this. We weren't that excited by the performance that we saw. I think there's probably a lot of room for improvement here. Maybe if we have better analysis or better testing algorithms, we can probably use even sparser matrices and improve things further. But the way it is right now, at least with the breakdown parameters that we were trying out, it doesn't really seem faster than doing low-degree extensions. So the other thing I forgot to mention is that these tensor-based PCSs don't have the best succinctness compared to something like Frye. So, part of that is because the codes don't have very good distance compared to Reed-Solomon codes. So what if we use the same high-level tensor PCS, but use it with Reed-Solomon codes instead? If they're about the same cost, then at least we can get better minimum distance, which means fewer queries and better succinctness. And then since our field doesn't have good two-adicity, we can't just use a regular radix 2 FFT, but there are still alternative algorithms that we can use, which I think can be pretty practical. So yeah, this could be, so just to be clear, we haven't really decided which direction we're going, but yeah, this could be one option that's worth exploring more. But on the other hand, if we're already using Reed-Solomon codes, then maybe it's better just to stick with Frye. With Frye is usually used with a very smooth two-adic field, or two-adic multiplicative subgroup, rather. But we can do something like a mixed radix Frye, which is a little bit like a mixed radix Cooley-Turkey FFT, where maybe we have a subgroup. So actually, this is like the factorization of the multiplicative group of this Mersenne prime. And as you can see, there's only one factor of 2, but there's some factors like 3, 7, 11, which are also pretty small. So we can still use Frye on a subgroup like the one at the top would be like relatively smooth and would work well with Frye. And if we're not dealing with a very large circuit, then we can just stick to these small factors. We could use something like the second row if our circuit fits in 15 bits. And then we can run Frye on a relatively smooth subgroup. If we have a larger circuit, then it gets a bit harder because then we have to use one of these larger factors like 151. But we can always leave a large factor in the final polynomial when we're using Frye. So I think that's one way we can kind of mitigate this problem. And also, even if we end up having to do a really big fold in Fry, that hurts succinctness, but it's still not that bad compared to the BCG20 succinctness. So besides the PCS, we're also thinking about ways that we can improve the hashing performance of Plonky3. So just to recap, Plonky3 uses Poseidon. It uses like a Poseidon sponge for everything in the Merkle tree, both the leaves and the non-leaves. And one thing we, of course, want to explore is just some of the newer hash functions that are coming out, like tip5, for example, or maybe considering a more conventional hash like Blake3, which has very good performance. It would be a bit more costly for recursion, but I think it's okay. And another direction to explore, though, is maybe we can use something like the T5 scheme. Let's say we're using Blake3. We can make Blake3 even faster by using something like the T5 scheme, which lets us build a better compression function using fewer calls to the underlying 2-to-1 compression function. So yeah, those are the ideas we're thinking about, and I just wanted to take a step back and look at the overall performance and like what are the main bottlenecks. In Plonky3 right now, usually hashing takes about half the prover time. So if we switch to something like Blake3, then that would get dramatically better. Here's a benchmark of Blake3 on a machine with AVX 512, and you can see it's doing about 7 gigabits of hashing throughput per second, which is like pretty insane, and this is single-threaded as well. So yeah, hashing, I'm sure we can improve dramatically. Also, we're spending a lot of time doing transpositions in Plonky3. So we start with trace, which is in row major form, and then we transpose it to get the columns and do low degree extension on each separate column. So partly we can improve that by using more cache-friendly transpose, but we could also just avoid transposes entirely. What we could do potentially is just stay in row major form the whole time, and then we run sort of a batch FFT where the atomic element of this FFT is an entire row rather than a single value. And then when we go to build the Merkle tree, that's also row-wise. So really we're avoiding 2 transpose steps if we do it that way. But there are some trade-offs there. There could be some impact on our cache friendliness that we have to look at. Yeah, and besides that, I think just using the smaller field, this 31-bit field, would speed up a lot of things here. So even, like, a lot of these things are memory bound, so if we're loading half the data from memory, then everything should get twice as fast. For things like constraint evaluation, that's really limited by how quickly can we do field arithmetic on the CPU. And with this 31-bit Mersenne field, it's almost 10 times faster than the Goldilocks field, which is already pretty fast. This was some benchmarks that our teammate did on a M1 chip, and we're getting about 2.7 field multiplications per second of throughput using this like vectorized ARM code. That's about it. So yeah, we don't have anything very solid at this point, but I just wanted to share some early ideas, and maybe we can get some feedback and combine it, and maybe work with some other teams on making this really fast prover. So thank you.
Any questions for Daniel?
Firstly, it's awesome that you're kind of like cracking at the borderline like limits of performance here. I wonder, what is the story around the bits of security of the proof system, especially given that we're getting to smaller fields, more newer hashes, and so on?
Yeah, great question. So I think this is another thing we'd like to change. With Plonky3, we have a 64-bit field, and with things like the Plonk permutation argument, we don't get good enough soundness from one argument in the base field. So there are two ways we can do it. We can either repeat the checks to boost soundness, or we can do the check just once, but in an extension field. And Plonky3 is doing the repetition, but I think we'd like to move to just doing it in an extension field. It seems cleaner from a security perspective. There's no, with parallel repetition, we have to argue that it works with fiat Shamir, which is non-trivial. And yeah, I think it would be very clean if we can just say like everything works in this extension field, which is 128 bits, and then some of the data just happens to be compressed because it happens to fit into 31 bits.
Smaller? Like, I have a field,
Yeah.
suddenly I have a field of 1/4 the size, and because I lost security, I actually extended my field. So shouldn't the performance gains also go away during the field extension? I think that's always what I'm struggling with.
Yeah.
Like there should be some non-linearity probably as you're reducing your field size in the performance that you gain.
Yeah, some parts of the prover do scale with the size of the extension field, so they would end up being about the same cost. For example, when we're doing folding and fry, we basically, even Plonky3 runs fry in the extension field. So we're always going to be dealing with roughly 128-bit field elements. But the main thing is like committing, well, first doing the low degree extensions and then committing to that that witness data. And there isn't really a security argument for, it doesn't need to be larger than 32 bits. It's, yeah, so I guess we might see some parts of the protocol increase their share, like the fry folds only take about less than 10% right now, but as we optimize some of the other parts that scale with the base field size, then the fry part that's always 128-bit, that could get a bit more expensive.